A new year, a new iPhone. Feels like this year with Apple's new release, the non-pro phones are getting a little bit more pro for photography and the pro phones are getting more pro for video. Firstly, let's start off USB-C with USB 3 support across the board. How awesome is that? No more hunting for a lightning cable, and with USB-C support, it allows us to easily transfer photos and videos from our mirrorless cameras or drones straight into the iPhone for editing. It makes it super quick to get our images and videos out to socials or even just to airdrop to our friends. Now with that out of the way, let's start off with the iPhone 15. The iPhone 15 this year with its main shooter gets a 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor, allowing it to capture 24 megapixels normally, binned from that 48 file, and with the option this year to shoot at 48 megapixels straight into a HEIC file. So your first thought is it's probably getting the 48 megapixel sensor from last year's Pro phones. It's actually getting a brand new Sony sensor this year that is slightly smaller than the 14 Pro's sensor, and we'll get to that detail later. This is the first time a non-Pro iPhone is able to shoot any resolution higher than 12 megapixels, which is a huge deal. That 48 megapixel sensor has two options. By default, it's going to shoot at 24 megapixels, binning those 48 pixels down to get the best quality in both low light and in detail. Whereas there is the option to bump it up to a 48 megapixel straight into a HEIC file. Of course, just like previous years, there is no support for Pro RAW in the non-Pro iPhones, but it's still a massive deal being able to shoot that full resolution straight out of camera. Now, previously on the iPhone 14 Pro with its 48 megapixel sensor, Apple was binning the whole 48 megapixels down to 12 megapixels in order to get the most detail and quality out of it. This year, they're binning to 24 megapixels. So their all new imaging processing pipeline has to be better in order to maintain the detail and quality at 24 megapixels. It'll be really interesting to see how good these files are once we get our hands on the phone. However, I did notice something very interesting. It happened while they were discussing the Pro phones, but it looks like when it's low light and when it's in night mode, the camera actually does bin to 12 megapixels to capture even more detail and even more light, which is understandable, but they didn't really touch on it too much. So I wouldn't be surprised if in night mode, we're getting 12 megapixel photos, regular daytime 24, with the option of 48 if you so choose. And much like last year with this main shooter, we're getting the same 2x punch in while maintaining resolution in this new iPhone, which is really great for non-Pro buyers because they're now getting a semi-telephoto effect, being able to punch in without any quality loss. Now the iPhone 15's ultra wide, which I think is by far the most used lens for most people nowadays, didn't get any upgrade in terms of lens or sensor. It only got new coating to help with lens flares and reflections. But it would really be nice to see this lens get an update in future models because I feel like so many people are using this more and more as opposed to the main shooter. Don't get me wrong, it's still an amazing lens and sensor, but we're nearing like iPhone 11, iPhone 12 territory of when it last got its update. So it's getting a bit outdated at this point, despite the new processing and all the other features that will make this camera a little bit better year over year. I think this regular iPhone 15 is going to be the biggest jump for your average everyday person in terms of photo quality in a very long time from the iPhone. I'm excited to get our hands on it and see if the files match up to what I expect. This is going to be awesome for your everyday person, capturing even better photos than before. Now quickly, before I touch on the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max, let's talk about some quality of life features with portrait mode. Portrait mode now is automatic, so if it detects a human or a pet or an animal, it will automatically capture the depth data so that you can add portrait mode after the fact. And this year with portrait mode, you're now able to change the focus after the fact, much like you could do with cinematic mode, but now you can do it with photos as well. Now you could previously do this, but you had to use third-party apps, which is a bit clunky and not the most seamless of experiences. This is so good because I can't tell you how many times I've taken a portrait photo and it's focused on my dog's nose instead of the eyes. It's gonna be awesome to be able to recompose the focus, and get that proper depth data after the fact. Expect to see a lot, and I mean a lot, more portrait photos on Instagram. Now let's get to the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max, which I think this year had a bit more of a subtle update, except for the Pro Max, which we'll get to in a sec. Now this year, the main shooter is retaining the same sensor and lens as the iPhone 14 Pros. So that's the 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor at an f1.78 aperture. Now on paper, this actually seems worse than the iPhone 15 non-Pros, which also get a 48 megapixel sensor, but they get it at an f1.6 aperture. Now you can't really compare these apples to apples because while the 15 Pro sensor has a slower aperture lens, it actually has a larger sensor, meaning the pixels are larger and it's going to be able to retain more detail in low light. I think we'll find that the photo quality difference between the two cameras is extremely close, if not edging on the side of the iPhone 15 Pro. Now the reason for this is it's going to have improved processing from last year. Keeping the same sensor as last year, they would have been able to refine the processing for that sensor, and I think we'll see better photos overall still on the Pro. But it's going to be so close. It's going to be so close. And that's why it's kind of a bit of a side grade, because while there are some nice quality of life features here in the iPhone 15 Pro, such as the ability to change the main focal length between 24, 28, and 35, which is really nice. So you can dial in your perfect focal length that you would prefer and always shoot with that. Or even just like when you're on location with your mirrorless camera, be able to visualize what the focal lengths are going to look like before you change your lens. It's a really nice feature to have. But don't get me wrong, it's still the same 48 megapixel sensor, and cropping into 35 millimeters is just the same as digitally cropping down, or it's the same as zooming in a little bit on your iPhone 14 before you take the shutter. Keeping with the theme of the same as last year, both the ultra wide and the telephoto on the regular Pro are exactly the same as last year, them just having those new coatings for reflections and glare, which is kind of a bit disappointing given how much of an upgrade the regular iPhone 15 is this year. It's kind of sad to see that we're keeping the same hardware as last year on this iPhone 15 Pro. That's all except the iPhone 15 Pro Max, which is getting a substantial upgrade this year in terms of its telephoto ability. I feel like the telephoto lens for the longest time has been terrible on iPhones. It's always been mushy and low quality, and it's great to see that this lens is getting an upgrade. So the new iPhone 15 Pro Max is using a 5x 120mm 12 megapixel sensor at an f2.8 aperture. And this year it sports a 25% larger sensor in the telephoto as opposed to last year. The way they accomplished this year, rather than using a periscope style design that you see on other phone cameras, they're using a teleprism design, which bounces the light even more than a periscope lens. So we'll see if the quality is as good as it looks in their promo photos. And because it's not a periscope lens and it's a teleprism lens, it is a fixed lens. So there's no optical zooming between 1x or 2x or all the way up to 5x. I imagine that in between the focal lengths, they will be doing some computational magic to get even more quality. But in order to get the most quality out of this sensor, you have to be at the full 5x. And honestly, I think this is one of the most exciting upgrades to the iPhone camera, because being a telephoto lens, it's so much easier to get natural bokeh and subject separation, something that you can do on the older iPhones, but it looked so mushy and terrible that you never really wanted to switch to the 3x. So I'm hoping that this 5x camera is really good quality so that you actually want to switch to it to get that beautiful bokeh. But let's be real, as much as this lens can be used awesomely photographically, it's going to be used across a sports field to capture a photo of your kid or a moon photo that may or may not be faked. Time will tell. And despite that, I think the most pro feature of these Pro iPhones is still that USB-C port. While the regular iPhone 15 has it as well at the same speed, I still think that transferring your photos and videos straight from your camera and editing them in Lightroom on your phone is going to be the best feature by far. Also, it'll allow us to get our 48 megapixel photos straight off the phone into a storage device. especially if you don't have access to AirDrop. I feel like most photographers with an iPhone also have a Mac for AirDrop because it's such an essential feature sharing around photos. But just in case, it's an easier way to pull photos and videos off your iPhone. With the USB-C port, I feel like we're gonna see a lot more pro features slowly trickle their way into the iPhone. Apple did say you can tether directly into Capture One with the iPhone now, which is pretty cool, getting raw photos straight to a computer for a fast turnaround in a studio environment. However, I feel like we're gonna see even more features like, flash triggers and all sorts of things, but I feel like that's gonna be very slow and incremental and come further down the line. As photographers, we're having to shoot video more and more nowadays, and with these new iPhone 15 Pros, we get some awesome new video features. You can now shoot in a log profile with ACES support, which is going to be awesome for color grading your footage and matching it to other cameras. And as well, you can now shoot ProRes at 4K 30 or up to 4K 60 when using external media, which is going to be awesome if you're someone like MKBHD and you shoot ProRes on your iPhone and you just absolutely hate yourself sitting for hours waiting for it to transfer. You can now shoot it directly to external media, meaning no time wasted at all. Other than that, there's not too much for video. They didn't talk about cinematic mode or anything, but I'm sure there's improvements there. But if you want to see what sort of videos you can get out of an iPhone, you should check out this video here where I document my experience photographing the Everest Base Camp track all on my iPhone.